The Princess Who Liked to Be Popular. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, there was a princess who loved to be loved. She always made sure she made popular decisions so that her people would love her. And they did. If the people didn't like her hairstyle, she would change it. If the people said a certain color didn't suit her, she wouldn't wear it. Her parents, King Jerome and Queen Evangeline, were going on a cruise around the world for a year, and were leaving her in charge of the kingdom while they were gone. The young princess was very excited about the prospect of doing things her own way, and she knew she would be able to make her people happier, and they would love her more. But before he left, the king looked at his daughter, his face stern and serious, and said to her, "Primrose," for that was her name, "Primrose, remember, you cannot always please everyone. Make decisions because they are right, not just because they are popular." The princess smiled and nodded while he was talking, but as she walked away from the king, she raised her eyes to the heavens and thought to herself, "Oh, father, you are old. You don't understand the world of today. I will make decisions that will make people happy. How can that ever be wrong?" Unbeknown to the princess, her mother saw her expression and guessed what she was thinking. So Queen Evangeline, on the eve of her departure with her husband, visited her lifelong friend and confidant, Lady Beatrice. Lady Beatrice was very old, very wise, and mostly kept to herself. She lived in her cottage by the lake at the edge of the woods, and the queen, not wanting anyone to know where she was going, visited her incognito. When she returned home late that night, her mind had been put at ease, and she was able to set sail happily with her husband the next day. On Princess Primrose's first night in charge of the kingdom, she went to bed very happy. There were so many changes she wanted to make, so many ways she thought she could improve the happiness of her people, and therefore so many potential opportunities to increase their love for her. As she closed her eyes, a mist rose from the lake and engulfed the castle, causing everyone in it to slip into a sleep so deep that nothing could disturb them. Then Lady Beatrice arrived. She walked past the guards, who didn't wake up. She walked past the dogs, who didn't wake up. She walked through the corridors, past all the bedrooms, and no one woke up. And so, with the ease and confidence of someone who knows they won't get caught, she entered the princess's chamber. Chapter 2. Princess Primrose awoke the next morning to the sound of birdsong as sunlight streamed through her open window. She smiled broadly. "The first thing I'll do," she said to herself, "is call a public meeting and ask the people what they want." So right after breakfast, she summoned the town crier and instructed him to announce the meeting. "At 10 o'clock, she said, "on the green beyond the lake, and I will ask them how I can best serve their needs." Thus he announced, and they came. Princess Primrose addressed the people by simply asking them, "What can I do for you?" At first, the only response was one small voice. "Nothing? Thank you, Princess. We already have everything we need." The princess smiled at the child who stood among the sunflowers and smiled back at her. Then more voices spoke up from the crowd. "I wish I could afford to buy enough cotton to make 2 night dresses, but it is expensive, so I can only afford enough for 1. I work hard to support my family, but most of my money is spent on food. It would be nice if I was able to save some." "I have to save up 2 weeks' pocket money to afford a bar of chocolate." And so the princess wrote it all down in her blue book. Her blue book where she kept a record of everything she did and everything she planned to do. She didn't want to forget anything. That very afternoon, the Duke of Equitas stood before the princess in her father's study. "From whom do we buy cotton, cocoa, fruit, and vegetables?" she asked him. "From the Kaladam nation, Your Highness. We have amicably traded with their people for many years," he replied. "Well, it's time you got us a better deal." Equitas was taken aback. "Forgive me, Your Highness, but we already have a good deal. We pay a fair price for top quality produce. It's a good deal for us and a good deal for them." "My people want it cheaper so that they can afford more, and I intend to give them what they want. Sir, I insist that you make it happen. Renegotiate the deal." Equitas took a deep breath. "Your Highness, I have in my possession a decree written by your father, which gives me complete discretion in our trade agreements with Kaladam Taram. The king has put his trust in me, and I will not be persuaded to betray it. Our trade agreements are long-standing, fair, and amicable, and I will not renegotiate." The princess seethed. The Duke was nervous but stood his ground. They looked at each other in silence for several moments until she, unable to counter his argument, dismissed him. She slumped over the desk and felt very sorry for herself. "The first thing they ask me for, and I can't deliver," she said out loud. "Perhaps you can," said a strange voice. "Ah! Where did you come from?" The princess jumped and stood up straight, embarrassed to have been overheard, and alarmed to be looking at a strange person who had apparently appeared from nowhere. "I'm sorry, Princess. I didn't mean to startle you." He smiled warmly. "Who are you, and where did you come from?" she asked again, calmer now, but wary. "I apologize. My name is Venustus. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with the Duke, and I believe I can help. First tell me where you're from, and how you got into the castle." As Venustus's smile broadened, the princess's mistrust faded away, and she forgot her question. "I can get you what you're looking for," he said. "Make your trade with me." "My father decreed that only Equitas can make the trade." "With Kaladam Taram. But what's to stop you from trading with another party?" The princess hesitated. "Nothing, I suppose. But we're already getting a fair deal, so I won't be able to do better." "So says the Duke. But how can that be true if I can get you those goods for half the price?" So Princess Primrose made a deal with Venustus, and very soon the cheap goods were on the market. Her people were delighted to find what they needed at such low prices, and, as she'd hoped, loved her for listening to them and getting them what they wanted. The princess was very pleased with herself and basked in the adoration of the populace, which she read about almost every day. But not everyone was happy with the new arrangements. The Duke was very concerned as the produce from Caladam Taram went bad on the shelves, and he discovered that the princess was trading with Venustus. He urgently begged an audience with her, but when she refused to see him, he wrote to her daily. The first few letters she binned, but after a while she didn't even bother to read them. After all, hadn't her father told her that it was impossible to please everyone? Well, if the Duke of Equitas wasn't pleased, then that was something she'd just have to live with. And since he seemed to be the only one who wasn't happy, she could be pretty satisfied that she'd done a good job. And she was. For a while. Until grandfather died. The old man had no family of his own, but everyone called him grandfather. He was kind and cheerful and loved to talk. He could talk for hours, but no one minded because talking to him always brightened their day. When news of grandfather's death reached the castle, the princess was saddened. But when she learned that more people were falling ill, a cold chill shivered through her body. Princess Primrose desperately hoped that this was not her fault, that the sickness pervading her beloved people was not caused by the cheap fruits and vegetables she had imported through Venustus. But she couldn't find Venustus. The only thing she could do, she decided, was to tell everyone to stop eating the cheap produce, to admit that it might be the cause of their illness. But the people took no notice. They dismissed as ridiculous the suggestion that the cheap produce might be unhealthy. Sickness comes and goes, they said. It's probably the weather, they said. It will pass, they said. The princess was flabbergasted. It's as if they're under a spell, she exclaimed. It's worse than that, said a familiar voice. The Duke of Equitas stood before the princess for the first time in many months. After an embarrassed pause, she forced herself to ask, Worse? When I heard you were dealing with Venustus, I tried to find out more about him. He is very hard to track down, and I could find only 3 references to him in our archives, one of which dates back 400 years. 400 years? That must have been a different Venustus. His ancestor, perhaps. No, there are no others. He's a wizard, Your Highness. He changes appearance to appeal to whomever he's attempting to fool. But apparently, he is unable to change his name. It's the only thing he is truthful about. The princess was exasperated. That's absurd, she said. How do you know this? The Duke continued. The 400-year-old reference to Venustus was written by the monks of the ancient Luna monastery. It is in the form of a rhyme, so that everyone would recite it and remember it. When I read it, I became very concerned indeed. The monks only created memory rhymes for things they considered extremely dangerous. It was vital to them that this be remembered generation after generation. The princess listened apprehensively as the Duke read aloud. Venustus he was. Venustus he is. Venustus he'll always be. He'll lie about everything else in the world, but truthful about that he'll be. Venustus is wicked. Venustus is false. Venustus will use and abuse. Remember his name. Remember his name. Keep thyself safe from his ruse. When he finished, Equitas paused and looked at the princess. He hesitated to continue burdening her when she looked so defeated. But there was more, and he had to go on. Equitas went on to explain that he had found a record of Venustus among the surviving documents of the Procol County jail fire 147 years previous. It was slightly fire damaged, but the charges made against him were still clearly legible. It is uncertain how the fire started, but Venustus was the only prisoner not accounted for after it was put out, the Duke added. But by far the most useful information I have found is contained in this book, he said as he placed a small, tattered volume on the table. It belongs to the estate of an elderly lady who recently passed, named Gertrude. She was deaf her whole life, and when she was a little girl, her mother would write down every piece of news and gossip for her to enjoy in this book. There is here a detailed account of Venustus. Chapter 3. Equitas leafed through the book to find the story of Venustus, as told by Gertrude's mother, while Princess Primrose looked upon the list of Venustus's crimes with horror. She nodded sadly at him, and he began to read. Elsie, from across the sea, says, "They're having troubles over there." She told a sailor, who told his uncle, who told his wife, and she told me. The fruit and vegetable growers were having troubles. They had had some bad weather, which led to their harvest being poor, and some of them were worried that they wouldn't have enough food to get them through the winter. Luckily, they have a good community, and they had a meeting and realized that if they shared what they had evenly between them, they would each have enough to scrape by. They also agreed to distribute equally what seeds they had between them for the following year. They wouldn't be able to sow as much as usual, but again, they knew it would be enough. They would manage. Satisfied and relieved, they were about to return home when a kindly stranger called their attention back to the meeting. He said he thought he could help. Oh, my word! It would have been better for them if they had pretended not to hear him and walked away, but they didn't. He said his name was Venustus, and he could provide them with plenty of seed for the next year, so that they wouldn't have to scrape by. He said he had more than he could use in a huge barn on his property, and they could have it for nothing to prevent it going to waste. Well, he looked so kind and had such a warm smile. Elsie said that they couldn't help but trust him. He asked everyone who wanted his seeds to sign their name on a sheet of paper so that he would know how much to ship to them. The following spring, as promised, the seeds arrived, and everyone was thrilled. They sowed so many seeds that they looked forward to a bountiful harvest. So, green shoots began to grow, and everyone was hopeful until, after a few weeks, they started to wilt. They couldn't understand why, because the weather had been perfect. Sunshine and showers, and just the right amount of each. So they contacted Venustus to ask his advice. Well, that's when he tells them he's a wizard. He made them seeds special so they grow much bigger and faster, but only if they're fed with his magic potion. Without it, they would not survive at all. Of course, the people asked if they could have some of his potion, and he says, "Of course you can. It's 20 pieces of silver per vat." Oh my goodness. You can imagine how the people felt. They had no money. They couldn't pay for the potion, and they would have no harvest at all without it. They pleaded with Venustas to let them have the potion on credit, promising to pay him out of the profits from the sale of their produce. Then he tells them that he will sell their produce, as they agreed in the contract they signed, and take his cut before passing to them whatever's left. What contract? They said. And he shows them the paper with their signatures on it. The contract had been added above their names. My goodness, girl. There were many there at that moment who could have throttled him, but as the first man lunged, Venustus smiled and said, "Perhaps we can make a deal." He ummed and awed for a few moments before adding, "Give me your children in return for as much potion as you need." And while they still reeled from shock, he said, "If you starve, they starve. With me they'll live." I swear on my life, Gertrude, that's what he said. Well, according to Elsie, there was no holding people back after that. Many of them flew at the wizard in their desperation at the thought of losing their children and their anger at having been so cruelly tricked. But Venustus didn't flinch. He smiled smugly as a glow of light surrounded his body and every strike just bounced off it. He was untouchable. What could they do? It was too late in the season to sow the seeds from last year, which by next year would be too old. They had to do as the wizard told them. All children over 10 years old were taken to a cocoa farm, where they worked from sun up to sun down, slept in windowless sheds, and ate a very poor diet. They were beaten if they didn't work fast enough. And Venustus just got richer. And as if that wasn't enough for these poor people to cope with, they started to get sick. After eating produce grown from the magic seeds, fed with the magic potions, this normally healthy community began to develop illnesses they'd never seen before. Contamination by magic potions killed the fish in the rivers and the insects of the air and soil. Birds and animals died or moved away. Everything stank. "Oh, stop! Stop!" The princess snatched the book from the Duke's hand and slammed it down. "I can't listen to any more. It's horrible. This is the price of our cheap food. This is why my people are sick." She dropped to the floor, full of remorse, and just sobbed. "It's all my fault. I wish I'd listened to you. I wish I'd listened to my father." Chapter 4. At that moment, Princess Primrose sat up in bed. Lady Beatrice was sitting close by, smiling. "Did you have a bad dream, my dear?" she asked. The princess was dazed. "A dream? It was just a dream? I imagined it all?" She reached for her blue book. "Well," said the old lady, "yes and no. It's hard to take in, I know, but as you can see from your book, this is your first morning in charge of the kingdom. None of what you dreamt about has happened yet." The princess was bewildered. She looked at her last blue book entry and realized that her mother's friend's explanation was the only one possible. Relief began to wash over her. Then she tensed. "Yet?" she asked nervously. Lady Beatrice explained. The queen was very concerned about leaving you in charge, given your inexperience and eagerness to please. So I simulated in your dream what would happen if you proceeded as she expected. But the monk's memory rhyme, the fire-damaged arrest record, and Gertrude's book all really do exist in the archives. Venustus is horribly real. He just hasn't come here yet. The princess was confused. But how did you simulate my dream? How did you know what would happen? Lady Beatrice hesitated before answering. Your mother is the only other person who knows this. I hope I can trust your discretion. The princess nodded, and she went on. I am a fairy, the last of my kind here, because the others were long ago poisoned by an evil wizard. Fairies can take any size. When I was a young girl, 1,000 years ago, I was as small as a dragonfly. We helped with pollination and feasted on flowers and fruit. It was a beautiful, enchanting, wild life. Then I fell in love with a sailor, assumed human size, and traveled the world with him. Being human, he aged much faster than I, and when he passed away, I returned home. My exquisite ancestral home had become a contaminated wasteland. Hardly anyone was living there anymore, so it was difficult to find out what had happened. But eventually, an old owl who had been watching me for some time took pity on me. He described a situation very similar to that depicted in Gertrude's book, which led to the death of all the pollinating insects and fairies, and the exodus of many other species. Possessed of the knowledge of all of his ancestors, the owl was able to give me some hope. He said that when such a wizard was vanquished, all their evil was undone. But, he said, there was only one way to do it. The wizard must be tricked into tasting his own potion, and while he is doing so, his name must be repeated to him 3 times backwards. Then the world would be as if he had never been born. But the owl didn't know his name, or how to find him. I searched for many years without luck, and eventually settled here. And if your mother hadn't asked me to protect you from yourself, if I hadn't psychically perused the kingdom's archives, I may never have discovered his name. Now we not only know that, we also know where he'll be if you reenact the beginning of the dream. The princess was excited at the prospect of defeating the wizard. But how will you get him to eat his magic potion? She asked. Lady B was excited too. We know that Venustus takes advantage of the naive and vulnerable. Now, 2 months ago, King Arnaud died, leaving his unworldly son, Albro, in charge. I wouldn't be surprised if that kingdom is already in receipt of potion-dosed produce. There was no time to lose. The princess was well known, so she dressed in disguise. Then, while she rode to young King Albro's territory, Lady Beatrice informed the Duke of their plan. He would need to be in on it. Once over the border, Princess Primrose searched for the marketplace. She needed to make sure they were indeed selling magic produce. Before long she found the market. Some stalls were piled high with colorful, irregular-shaped, delicious-smelling produce. Others displayed equally enticing goods, but they were all uniform in shape, color, and size. And the smell, there was no smell. The unnatural food was cheap and selling fast. Princess Primrose smiled at the stallholder. This is just what I need, she said. In an effort to reproduce the events of the dream as faithfully as possible, the princess had notice of a public meeting announced as soon as she got home. Then, as in the dream, she asked the people what she could do for them. When they asked for cheaper food and cotton, she wrote it all down in her blue book and told them she would do her best. She then returned to the castle and summoned the Duke. However, unlike the dream, when the Duke of Equitas arrived, he brought with him a basket of fruit. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing, "please accept this gift from the people of Caladam Taram, with their compliments and best wishes for your 12-month reign." The princess smiled and indicated that he should place the basket on the table. "Thank you," she smiled. "Let's talk trade." The princess argued with the Duke, just as she dreamt, and Equitas impressively stood his ground. He showed her the king's decree, and she dismissed him. Lady Beatrice, meanwhile, having resumed her miniature stature, was observing to ensure everything went to plan. The wizard could be anywhere, watching, waiting for an opportunity. He wasn't stupid. He was not stupid. Suddenly the old fairy was struck by that frightening realization. He is not stupid. He'll know that that fruit is not natural. It doesn't smell. He's not going to fall for it. By now the princess was slumped over the table, complaining about her inability to give the people what they want, and Venustus was climbing in through the window. Lady Beatrice had to do something. There was only one thing she could do. She closed her eyes and spoke so quietly that even the mouse couldn't hear. "Power of the elements, I call on thee. From air, earth, and water, come forth, help me. On fruits in the basket, I beg you bestow the sense they would have when in nature they grow." At the same time, the princess was listening to Venustus's claim that he could get her a better deal. "I don't know," she said, reaching for an apple. "My people are used to top-quality produce. I want it cheaper, but not if it's substandard." She took a bite and smiled at him. "Seriously," she added, "your stuff can't be as good as this. Go ahead, try some. Then you'll know what I mean." Venustus returned her smile, and with the sweet, mouth-watering smell of fresh fruit in his nostrils, carelessly took a cherry. As soon as it touched his tongue, the princess spat out her apple and spoke swiftly. "Setsunev! Setsunev! Setsunev!" The wizard's eyes widened. His sharp intake of breath made him start choking on the cherry. Then came a crash of thunder, and he was gone. "We did it!" The princess was jubilant. "You were brilliant," Lady Beatrice told her, as the Duke returned to the room. "But remember, no one else can know about this. As far as the rest of the world knows, Venustus was never here. There'll be no public recognition." "That's okay," the princess smiled. "It's enough just to know we set things right. Thank you, both of you." The following morning, Princess Primrose told her people that she wouldn't be able to get them cheaper food and fabrics after all. "I have discovered," she explained, "that we are already paying a fair price for those goods. The only way for us to get them cheaper would be to cheat the growers out of their hard-earned money, to reduce their quality of life in order to improve ours. And that's just not right." There were some nods of agreement and some grumbles of discontent. "I thought you would put your own people first," someone shouted. "As one young lady said yesterday, my people already have everything they need. They work hard for it, and they don't have much left over. but they are not short of any essentials. Do not the people who grow your food deserve this much? Fair is only fair if it's fair for everyone. The crowd began to disperse, and the princess smiled as she noticed Grandfather, still alive, talking cheerfully to one of his neighbors. There were a few disgruntled faces, but the princess, understanding her father's advice now, was not disheartened. As she walked away, she overheard a snippet of conversation.
What is she wearing? I don't like her hair.
That's okay, she said to herself. I like it. And they all lived happily ever after. The end.